pleasure to have you on the show, Ilya. How's it going?
Going pretty well. Thanks, Alex.
Good. So just real quick, for our listeners and all our viewers, just give us a rundown. How did you get here? How did you start your firm? And it's just, start from the beginning.
Sure. So more recently, Zlatkin Wong is a pretty young firm. We just formally launched October of 2019, so barely on the map. But this is actually not my first time launching a firm. My current partner and I, we left our previous firm where I personally had worked for almost 4 years. Okay. But before I had joined that firm, I had my own law firm relatively fresh out of law school, barely a year out, I'd say. And I think that would be the more fun, scary, very alone experience to talk about. That was back in 2014. I'd graduated law school in 2013. I went to law school in Virginia, and so having decided that I was going to move to Chicago, it was pretty tough to find a job as for lawyers generally in 2013. And of course, within Chicago, nobody really knows University of Richmond, which is where I had graduated from, and there's not much of a network. People, I think, law students generally, I think, have this tendency to chase rankings, and I guess that probably spans across different parts of academia, not just law. But there's no substitute for 3 years of networking, right?
Yeah. Right.
So regardless of any sort of school rankings, if you have an opportunity to network with attorneys in Chicago on a regular basis, as a lot of the students that go to the Chicago-based law schools have, there's really no substitute for that.
Yeah. Why did you come to Chicago?
Sure. So in large part, it's because choosing where to take the bar exam is a bit of a geographic decision.
Okay.
That commits you to a particular place for, I'd say, at least 5 years, because you don't want to retake the bar exam. And typically, even with states that do have reciprocity, you can't claim that reciprocity until you've practiced at least 5 years in a particular state. But aside from that, it just, I was in my mid-20s, and I had, after my family immigrated from Eastern Europe, I had grown up in Richmond. Okay. I'd gone to undergrad at University of Virginia, so about an hour away. Yeah. And then I went to law school at University of Richmond. So that's, a good decade and a half plus of living in one place. And I was ready for something new. I don't want to say I was ready for the big city, because I had kind of categorically decided never going to live in New York. Yeah. But Chicago was a good mix. The more important component for me was being around more Russian speakers, just having more of that community around. Okay. I have plenty to say on that topic specifically that, 6 years hence, I've gotten experience with that, and, my expectations have been somewhat subverted in a lot of ways, but that's not the topic of this podcast. And I also have relatives that live in the northern suburbs here. And of course, for somebody coming from outside of Chicago, if somebody lives in Vernon Hills, you're like, I have relatives in Chicago. Yeah. So that's that was a large driver for me to move out here. I had actually planned to move to Chicago even while I was still an undergrad. And at the same time, I just didn't really focus on applying to very many law schools in Chicago, and that's part of what I had alluded to. Yeah. But just decided that I was going to move out here, and it was really tough to find a job at the time. And I did manage to reach out to some University of Richmond alumni here. One of them became, I'd say, my number one mentor, certainly at the time, very giving with his time. And he had just left his firm. I guess at the time he would have been about 8 years out of law school and practicing. And he had just gone out on his own with a partner, so not entirely on his own. And he asked me as I was there, doing one of those informational meetings, hey, can you help me find a job? One of the things he said was, well, have you thought about going out on your own?
Mm-hmm.
And at the time I was probably, this is March of 2014. I'd graduated in May of 2013 and had kind of bounced around before that. I can talk plenty about it. But he said that, and I thought, well, yeah, I've thought about it and I've discarded that idea like that, because A, I wouldn't know how to do anything, and B, there's so many potential ethical pitfalls. I'd lose my license before I even had a chance to use it, right? Yeah. And as I found out after the fact, I mean, those really should not have been the primary concerns for any lawyer. I think it probably would translate also across industries. The number one concern, really the only question, is where are you going to get clients?
I was going to say, exactly.
That's like the one thing that is the driver of having a professional services practice. And, I thought at the time I was about to turn 26, I was single and I had just moved to a new city. Like, the only thing that I had to answer for was keeping a roof over my head and feeding myself. And so I figured that's the time to take risks.
Yeah.
I didn't really have much savings. I did do some document review work. I don't know how familiar you are with document review as part of the legal industry, but it's somewhat, in my opinion, a purgatory for lawyers, because the tasks that you're doing, at least in my experience, are very not stimulating. It's, I've heard people refer to it as monkey work. I don't know if I'd necessarily agree, but ultimately, I don't think, to be able to functionally perform what I had to do, I don't think I would have had to graduate high school.
Oh.
Right? But I needed a law license to do it. So, it's very...
Is it just grammatical?
It's reviewing emails and logging them, right? It's making sure, as part of, you may have heard it referred to as e-discovery. With, civil litigation. There's a lot of files. They need to be sorted to figure out what needs to be disclosed to whom, what needs to be filed, right? And so you need attorneys to go through and review that, right? But law firms and certainly clients, they don't want to be paying law firms to have their associates or whoever that actually works there full-time doing that. Instead, they hire contractors, especially because you don't necessarily know how much work there needs to be. So it could be something that's done in 3 days. It could be something that's done 3 years. It's and that's part of the frustration with it, is that there's no stability and there's no predictability. So you've got something being pitched as being a 3-week project, and it's over in 3 days, right? And you made plans around it. It's difficult, right? Same thing, like a 3-week project, it goes on for 3 months. And of course, there's plenty of outliers in both directions. So at the same time, it's just really not something that, in my opinion, you can truly, is it okay to curse on here?
Absolutely.
It's not something you can bitch about,
Right.
because because it's because it pays, right? Like you get, at the time, market rate was probably $30 an hour with overtime. And again, you're doing the type of work that skill set wise is not all that anything, right?
And I came from the corporate world. It kind of sounds like bitch work in common terms, right? So, and I think that one of the things that you guys can relate to is, Eric, similarly, when he got out of the Army and whatnot, we've talked about this before, he didn't have like a formal job, right? I had corporate job. I stayed in for a little while. I had the savings. I thought about it a lot more, and then I made the jump. But it sounds like you two, you guys just kind of dove right into it. Ilya, it sounds like for you, kind of by by choice slash you had to, but so like starting off in the beginning like that, like you were saying, you didn't have too many like responsibilities, but how did you kind of get going, get your first client, and kind of start seeing like the fruits of your labors?
Right. Not for a long time.
Okay.
I'd say that now is probably the first time, the second go round with my firm, that I'm truly starting to see the fruits of my labor.
Oh, that's awesome.
I mean, it might
Yeah.
not be entirely fair of me to say that relative to my prior firm, but I'd say that the second time that I've gone out on my own is really when I'm like starting to see, okay, great, this is what you've built.
Right, that's awesome, because that's 5 years, just for the people listening. So nothing,
Yeah.
we always talk about nothing happens overnight, and just to hear that's like super inspirational, honestly.
That's encouraging to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the time, I like to say a lot of the time, just if I'll get the mantras
Right.
out there, the key to business success, right, is not a secret. It's just long-term relationships. And long-term relationships, by definition, require time.
Yes.
Right.
So if somebody, you've probably heard, the reason why most businesses fail is because they quit too early. And I'm sure there's additional reasons. Obviously, there's a way to refine your operations, optimize it. But I tend to agree, because I really started, I'd say upticks, right? Just tracking upticks in people reaching out, because you've heard of the sales funnel,
Right.
and that's just as relevant for legal services as it is for everything else. So I remember the first year, somebody reaches out or just somebody calls, and you're just like,
Yeah.
finally, there's movement. There's movement. And it just doesn't go that way, right? Like somebody ghosts you.
I'm so used to this.
Just generally to go from the point of somebody says, hey, I'm interested in hiring a lawyer, to the point where somebody actually signs an engagement letter, which isn't the end all be all, right? The goal is to actually do good work and get paid. So somebody says, I want to hire you, to the point where you have a signed engagement letter, to the point where you actually have an assignment, to the point where you actually get paid. That's months.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so building a pipeline of that is what it's all about, and that's what having a client base is about. And when you're starting out from scratch in a new geographic region with pretty much no contacts, it takes time.
So when you were doing the document review, was that for another firm, or were you doing it kind of on your own?
No.
How does that work?
So it works through staffing agencies.
Okay.
A big firm has a case that needs to be staffed. They reach out to a staffing agency, multiple staffing agencies in most instances. And so the staffing agency, they send out a bid of, and it's such a, at least at the time, it was such a buyer's market.
Yeah.
That it's just a race to the bottom, it almost felt like. But, again, it's not something to truly complain about, because for the type of work that you're doing, there's people breaking their backs out there for less money, going with the chiropractor theme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, it's difficult to complain about, because it is still white collar work.
Yeah.
And as unfulfilling as it might be.
Yeah. And then from there, was that what you did basically until you joined a larger firm, or?
My firm? So I did not do, I did some document review before I formally launched my firm.
Oh, got it.
So I had decided that I was going to go out on my own in April of 2014.
That's just like 1 month away.
Yeah.
1 month.
1 month difference, right? Yeah.
From having that conversation,
Right, yeah.
from moving
Yeah.
here,
Right.
Yeah.
permanently. So then I did the doc review. I was fortunate enough to have one of those 3-week advertised projects turn into a 3 to 4 month project. And so like May to August, I worked on one of these projects with a big firm, and allowed me to save up, right? It's a lot easier to do unfulfilling work when you know that it's just a means to an end rather than the end.
Yeah.
And so that helped. It allowed me to, in my spare time, kind of focus on taking care of formalities. You know, I formed my LLC in June of that year, and then, you know, worked on getting malpractice insurance, which is kind of like that. It's not technically required for lawyers, but it's definitely I would say, a base checklist item and when you're launching a firm. And took care of that sort of stuff, you know, while saving up a little bit. Definitely did not save enough.
Yeah.
Just for sure.
Chicago expenses.
Yeah, well, and it's just really easy. You know, at the very beginning, the key is to really focus on your cash flow, and it's really easy to get caught up in it's a business deduction. Now, I'm a business owner, guys.
Right.
This lunch, it's a business deduction, at least at the time, you know, before tax changes or whatever. So it's very easy to get caught up with I'm an entrepreneur now, and it takes money to make money. And here's an opportunity for me to spend money and claim a tax deduction.
Yeah.
The key at the beginning is to really focus on increasing and stabilizing cash flows. And that's something, that knowledge, that experience from that first time is something that I had that's definitely impacted this new launch of ours that you know, has gone well and has all sorts of new problems that are, you know, good problems, but just totally different problems from that first time.
Yeah.
But the cash flow at the beginning was non-existent with my first launch in 2014. And at the end of the first month, I had one client. And all the plans of the type of practice I wanted to have, and the types of clients I wanted to have, the type of work I wanted to be doing, this was, of course, outside of that. Completely different. And that first case turned into just kind of an expensive continuing education for me, in that whatever money I earned, I mean, probably the time that I spent on that case, it was the type of case that only an inexperienced attorney would ever accept. And, you know, I ended up having to pay money to get out of it. And it was that kind of experience. Certainly made mistakes along the way, but that experience also definitely has helped me avoid some subsequent cases that you know, I might have accepted if I didn't have that initial experience. So, you know, the first month I had that one client. Second month I had 2 additional clients.
That's good.
And of course, you feel like, oh man,
50%
on top of the
growth.
world.
Yeah, we're on. And you know, then later you have a quiet month, and you're like, well, what just happened? And then again, going back to the pipeline, sometimes somebody actually has a need, right? And so they reach out and they're ready to go, and they need a lawyer. Other times, and really it's important to note that this varies by practice area, right? With business law, and specifically transactional work, right? Not litigation. You're focused on building, really. You're doing all sorts of different contracts. Some of them might be focused on phasing things out, firing people, whatever. But ultimately, the focus is growth. And the way for a firm to grow itself is to grow with its clients, right? It's really a direct function of clients' growth or change that clients undergo. And look, none of what I do on a daily basis is life or death. I'll be the first to admit that.
Yeah.
And like, nothing is truly an emergency, right? Like, everything is an emergency, but nobody's going to jail.
Yeah.
Nobody's dying. there are lawyers out there that do things that actually, truly makes a difference on a day-to-day basis. And I'd like to think that I make a difference. I certainly do the type of work that I enjoy now, but it's just not that level, right? So you focus on growing with people. Back to it takes time.
Right.
That's just how it's always going to be, that to foster those relationships to the point where somebody has a need, right? The ideal situation for a lawyer to be in is where they're a person as opposed to an asset or a lawyer for somebody, right? That's part of the reason. Do you guys talk about 2112 on here at all? Or
yeah, absolutely.
That's part of the reason why it's a great environment, certainly for us, is because you meet people,
right?
And you're the person first. I'm Ilya first, and then lawyer second. If somebody has like this terrible thing happen to them that they just need a lawyer because there's a problem already, then that lawyer is not a person first.
Right.
And while that can be perfectly fine and unavoidable for situations where a problem exists and it just needs to be dealt with as soon as possible, it's not the best for just from a practice building perspective. It's just not the best for me, right? Because if we help solve that problem for that somebody, it's a good feeling. Hopefully it's something that's conducive to their growth so we can have a continuing relationship. But sometimes it's just one of those things that they don't want to. You can do the best job ever and they don't want to see you again, right? Think of a personal injury attorney, right? Or a divorce lawyer. They can be the best, right? They can be the best, and you could have had as painless an experience as possible, but ultimately you don't want to ever have to be dealing with that person again.
That makes sense.
On the other hand, the lifeblood of the type of practice like ours is it survives on having to be dealt with again, and quite frankly, wanting for somebody to. I like to say I want to reach a point where paying my invoices becomes a hobby for people, right? Because they're at that level where it's a business expense and I'm an entrepreneur, but not just posing, right? But actually have grown to that point where it makes sense and it's not a cost, it's an investment. So that's I don't know, does that answer whatever question?
No, absolutely, no. And like just being the Alone and So Very Afraid podcast. So back to your beginning times, what was like the big punch in the gut, like big failure moment that really hit you, that when you were first starting off, maybe you weren't ready for this with this client yet, or maybe something you should have said no, that just really brought you down and like kind of put you in like a dark place?
I haven't really had true down experiences. Part of that is, again, this industry that I deal with. Part of it is having a long-term focus.
Right.
There's certainly been challenges along the way. That first case that I mentioned, that was certainly something that I'm not super happy about, other than the fact that it was a learning experience. I've had a few, when I do dabble in litigation, there have been instances where, court has ruled in a way that I haven't agreed with. But even recently, for example, or not so recently, we had a pretty high profile case at my last firm in the entertainment space that we were just feeling good about, and then we got our asses absolutely handed to us by big law. It was that was not pleasant, right? But just this past Friday, my partner and I, we had a successful court rule in our favor on a case that we're handling, using the arguments that the other side had used in that case where we got our asses
That's
handed
awesome.
to us.
Yeah.
Right. And that arguably is like the best feeling for me right now from that, is that like that ass whooping
Yeah.
was not in vain.
Right. Right.
Definitely made me a better attorney. But in terms of true down moments, running up credit card debt,
Oh yeah.
and then pretty much having to be bailed out by my wife. That was real painful, and especially at the time, like it's my now wife. You know, we were at a relatively early stage of our relationship at the time, and it's not just that it's a strain on our relationship, right? What it does is it kind of places some doubt on just what the motivations are within a relationship with a significant other,
sure.
right? And that's just an unpleasant thing, and everything's worked out. But I'd say that just needing help to repay debts is crushing.
Was that after your first year, or during your first year on your own, or was that?
Yeah, probably. Well, because I launched my business, and hopefully maybe somebody has some sort of takeaway on this, right? You launch a business, you have a pretty untarnished credit history.
Yeah.
So you apply for a business credit card and you get it. Great. You get a year's worth of interest-free credit carding, right? Super. And you're like, oh, I've always paid my credit cards on time. Right. It won't even matter. And that's great. And having the credit card and spending on it allows you to have a free business bank account. Yay, I'm going to save $15 a month, but I'm going to rack up, anyway. And then that year ends. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you have that interest starting to kick
that
in.
25% right there.
Right. and then you're like, well, I thought I'd be at a better point right now to be able to, pay this off. And it just keeps compounding. I've heard people say it's expensive to be poor.
Yes.
Right.
And it is, right? Like it's tough to get ahead when whatever spare income you might have goes towards paying down interest, towards credit card payments, towards just financing payments because you didn't make your payment on time, right? So, at the time, my now wife bailed me out, and I'm obviously super grateful, and she still married me.
Yeah.
So, must have not sucked.
You might have owed her a little bit. That's the
that's why
that was the interest on it.
Right. Well, she's still investing, I guess, in my future.
Was that was that a factor when you kind of went back to just another firm and then went away from working for yourself?
What led you back to the firm? I had a question about that too.
Yeah. So yes and no. I'd say probably not directly, at least, the number one factor, because the firm that I joined, it was not a traditional environment. I did not have a salary. It was an opportunity to what I considered at the time work on some more sophisticated matters, because I had reached a bit of a ceiling on the type of client I could bring in as a relatively young solo practitioner. And that you don't want to get stuck, same as you don't want to get stuck at doing doc review, you don't want to get stuck as that attorney with low rates who only does work for a particular type of client that can afford those services. Right. And then you don't bring in bigger clients, so you don't have experience, you don't build that experience, and you're just kind of stuck. 5 years have gone by and you haven't done something. So I joined that firm. I liked that it still had the entrepreneurial incentives, right? So as a second, third year attorney, I still had incentives to bring in business, which is not a given with associates in a firm. And I was not ever technically titled an associate, even though practically speaking, that's probably what I was at some points. I still had incentives to bring in business, obviously still do work. And yeah, part of it was that I was ready to have people to work with, because it does get lonely. So part of the reason is that our names were similar. Like, it sounds funny, but that was not, it was definitely a but-for cause of the thing happening. I joined here at 2112. And my firm at the time was very creatively called Zlatkin Law.
Oh, man.
With my last name.
Yeah. Right.
And then the managing partner of this other firm, also members here, also have a Z last name. And we at the time thought, hey, this probably too small of an environment for two Z last name law firms doing similar things. And that's just kind of what
That actually
part
is
of
funny.
a factor.
I remember when you were in that other firm, and I thought that was your last name.
Yeah.
Until you had to clarify for me and said, "Yeah, that's that." I joined and you told me that exact same story where you joined the firm because it was the Z.
Yeah. Well, and what that did in some ways is create an unnatural barrier to leaving, right? Because I suppose I could have left and gone to a traditional law firm, but I also felt somewhat like I was out of the matrix, that I would not really be able to go into the very rigid corporate structures, right? My entire career had been in this kind of independent, even while working with a firm, I had all this autonomy. Yeah. So I thought probably won't do that, especially the main thing, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's a super crucial one. I already alluded to where you're going to get clients as being like the primary thing. A client base and relationships, right, is the currency of, I assume everybody in professional services, but definitely in legal.
Yeah. It's the same thing in real estate.
Right, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, your clients are, that's your best friends, so you got to treat them well. So yeah, I was thinking exactly that,
Right. And it's crucial to not forget, that you need to be building a book of business, need to be building clients, because lawyers, I won't speak for real estate or other professions, but we're pretty darn replaceable, at least in terms of function that we perform, right? There's somebody else out there that's just as good as at doing the types of contracts. They're not a bad person, they've got decent character, right? But whatever trust I've been able to develop with people, that's the irreplaceable part. Right, and that's what keeps people working together.
I actually love that concept. To think about, I've always heard that it just takes time to actually grow out a business, and it's about just hanging on long enough. I never thought of it as just about the relationships that you're building during that time frame. There was one point for Elite Amateur Fight League, I was like, man, I hope one day that 20 years from now, someone in the industry is just gonna be like, oh yeah, Eric's just been here for 20 years, so he's got to know something, right? Like, and that was the hope, but I didn't think that it's all about those relationships that you've also been building for 20 years. That is what actually drives the business and clients to come. I love that, like that I'm gonna keep that perception or perspective. So definitely learned something today.
Who knew?
Yeah.
Well, so I had that kind of question. So I'm just like tying into with what I do in real estate and whatnot, and I'm just thinking like you can have like few clients and they stay with you, and that could be your business, you know, especially in like the real estate space. You don't need 50 to like 30, 70 clients. How is that in the law firm space? Are you just constantly looking to grow, or is it really just getting that core group of people, going with them, getting referrals out of them? How does that kind of look like?
Well, I mean, potentially my opinion on this is still being developed.
Okay.
Right? But I can tell you that it's a lot cheaper to maintain a client than it is to obtain a new client.
100%. I would agree with that.
And so, of course, you know, referrals from good clients to other good clients are awesome. And quite frankly, with our new firm that we've just launched, we have a landing page for a website. We have really barely any social media presence. So whatever success we've had thus far to date has been entirely word of mouth.
Awesome.
From our existing client base from before, people that wanted to continue working with us, to people, the new clients that have come in since we've launched. That has all been referral based and word of mouth, which is great. I don't know how scalable that is, right? Because it can, well, I just don't have the empirical evidence right now. The biggest challenge with a firm is how do you get clients to be okay dealing with your colleagues, not just you, right? Because then you're going to get overwhelmed and not...
Exactly. You only have so much time in the day, right?
Right, exactly. At the same time, while still giving the client the proper attention so that they don't feel like you've just pawned them off to somebody else, which in a two-person firm isn't as important, right? Because you, especially here where everybody knows my partner and me, but you know, with a bigger firm, and also when you've got associates, right? You have a partner handing off somebody to an associate. That, from a client's perspective, might not be a good feeling. Although, really, it's, even if it's really the only way of truly getting this work done timely and in a cost-efficient way, right? Because presumably the associate's time is worth less than the partner's time, and so for the partner, who's really the relationship manager, how do you make sure that the client feels like they're still getting your attention while still maintaining time in the day to actually, you know, get stuff done and grow your book? That I think is a big challenge. It's always a warm introduction is much better. So a referral. I've had sometimes great relationships start with clients, and just somebody found me online and reached out, and it turned into a long-term relationship where you just jive with somebody. But that's the icing on the cake. I think it's important to know what your bread and butter is, focus on building that specifically, making sure that you're known in whatever industries you're in, that is your bread and butter. And then if you get a whale coming through somehow, as I heard somebody say, that's your retirement plan. You can't build a business on landing whales, and I'm sure there's somebody out there that would disagree with me. But the focus is on building that core bread and butter business, and then being open to opportunities as they come up.
Did you learn that during the 4 or 5 years you were with the larger firm? Is that the reflection period? And then what made you kind of decide to jump over to being on your own again with another partner? So, I mean, realistically, why I left at its most basic
right? As there are points as you stay at a particular place sometimes for no other reason other than it's convenient to not change, inertia, and you haven't had that reason to reassess. And then something happens that causes you to reassess. And as you think about it, it starts to make more and more sense that, you know, staying the way you are is not sustainable. It doesn't keep you happy. And you don't really see a future at wherever it is that you're at.
Yeah.
So again, without going into too many details, and I just don't want to be putting stuff out there that you know is too off the cuff on that sort of thing, on why, you know, you leave a place. But I reassessed. It made sense to me. I have a spouse who has her own firm, has had her own firm for 6 years, and she's kind of been my hack along the way. That's worth mentioning.
Yeah.
That my wife, she's a little older than I am. She's been an attorney a significant amount of time, longer than I am, than I have been. She's gone through really all different types of roles that you could have as a lawyer. She's had during her career, and when we first found each other, she and I, we actually met at networking for solo practitioners, not just single practitioners, you know, people with their own practices. And so she's had all those experiences. And so for a young attorney who did not have much experience at all in the legal profession, having the benefit of her advice was just invaluable. And so I was fortunate enough more recently to have a spouse that supported me in going out on my own again. You know, she had less doubts about our prospects than I had, you know, because you have that fear of, well, what is it that I'm going to do when I leave?
Yeah.
And there is that, again, going back to the fluke of name similarity. If I'm going to go out on my own again, what the heck are you going to call this firm?
Yeah.
You're going to revert back to, you know, the similar sounding name that was causing some confusion. Yes, it's my name and that's his name, but what are you going to do? Like, it's going to be a branding nightmare. Just thinking about my email addresses.
Yeah.
Like, people still sometimes screw up and email the wrong address. So just thinking about what it is that you're going to call this business was a much bigger issue than it should have been. And then, of course, we still reverted to let's do our last names.
Yeah.
But that was part of the reason why I was really happy to have Jen join, is because, okay, well, we don't have to have Zlatkin Law.
Yeah.
We can have 2 last names, and that'll be different enough. And of course, she's wonderful. But that was kind of a side happy moment of why that happened. And so once you think about it again, you decide, okay, there's not much of a future here. Something needs to happen. I've got a spouse that supports me. I'll be all right.
No, that makes sense. I essentially call it, like, how I normally like to see it is, like, if you're in a position in a corporate world and you see, like, you know, within reason, what's like the highest position, you know, you see your boss or whatever, you see where they're at, you ask yourself, do you want to be that person? Can you see yourself doing that role? And if the answer is no, I mean, you probably don't have a future there, because that's going to be you if you continue where you're at. And for me, it took me a long time to, like, just realize that when I was in my corporate space, like, oh man, I can't see myself as a manager here or something like that. So why am I here? And I just left. So yeah. So yeah, actually, this is a little off topic, but you said your wife is a lawyer, right? And I see that a lot. Lawyers marrying all the lawyers, doctors marrying all the lawyers. That's just like, I mean, I think another lawyer that I know, he's also married another lawyer. Is that just like a thing?
I mean, I'm sure there's confounding variables.
Yeah.
Right? Because, I mean, I didn't set out to marry a lawyer, but there's a certain relatability.
Right.
Some people meet in law school.
That's true, right? Yeah.
Other people meet at a networking event. I think my wife and I are actually very different. Eric just met her last week. On paper, other than being lawyers,
Yeah.
we're very different.
Oh man, that's awesome.
And
Yeah,
happy to get into that.
Yeah, I could see the personality difference. Like right away. Yeah, he's much more subdued.
You said I am more subdued?
I think so.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I mean, there was a brief like interaction, less than 5 minutes probably, right?
yeah,
So,
she's funnier than I am.
Yeah.
Like I'll be the first to admit that. But we're actually, again, on paper, very different, and this isn't some relationship-based podcast.
Right.
You know, it turns out to be a good match, and yes, we can relate about a lot of challenges that we might see on a day-to-day basis because we're lawyers and we're both in private practice and we have our own firms, and so there is that relatability, and I think that helps. And I would really guess that a lot of it is for other professions, right? Opportunity. Just who is it that you're spending a lot of time around?
Yeah.
And if you and dating sucks when you grow up.
Oh yeah.
Right. So like going out and trying to find somebody from some different walk of life. You know, people that are different professions that get together, they probably still have something in common that allows them to relate to each other, whether it's our parents connected us or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting too, because it's just as entrepreneurs and people kind of stepping off on their own, we always seem to surround ourselves amongst a community of people who do something similar. And it doesn't have to be necessarily law, for example, you and your wife, but for us as like friendships, we all are on our own for entrepreneurship, but then those are our friends. So we have someone to relate to, because when we go back and try to talk to someone from a corporate setting, I remember going to like a veterans, I think it was like an association or something, but it was more for corporate networking. It was just people talking about how to climb the corporate ladder. Everyone seemed to be interested in like, oh, how do I position myself? And that was the advice that they were giving each other. And I found zero relevance to my life. And then starting to look for places like 2112, right? This is an entertainment incubator with startups. And that's when I found kind of community. And then along with Pad Scouts, right? You know, Alex and Dan, in the real estate space, it's a very kind of individual project-based type of industry. And then we all just hovered together to help support each other. And then same thing with Elite Amateur Fight League. It was through a class I think I took with Jesse, with veterans who were entrepreneurs, and then I thought it was an interesting project and I thought I'd help it out. And then now here we are, 2 years later. So I think that that's very, very common. And for entrepreneurs out there or creators out there who aren't doing that and trying to do something isolated just inside of their own homes and think that they're going to create something, I think is going to be a lot more challenging, you know, and more isolating.
I agree. And I think that going back to the analogy of being out of the matrix, right? I think that the corporate world versus entrepreneur world, which I'm sure they sometimes overlap, but
definitely.
That's probably like the biggest divide.
The red pill and the blue pill.
Exactly. And
true.
And it'll be interesting. I think you guys will get some answers to and different perspectives from my partner Jen when you guys interview her, because she obviously came from a big company, very briefly to our prior firm, and then now we've launched off. So I think you'll get that perspective.
Yeah.
From my perspective, it's sometimes difficult to relate to people that just see the world a different way. And I think it also speaks to, it's not easy to be self-aware enough to think about how in a matter that's different than what it is that you're used to, right? You expect things from people that you would expect from yourself. If you think that that person would do something, whether it's good or bad, it's because you know that you would do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Right?
Makes a lot of sense.
So understanding how it is in a massive corporate structure versus how things are as we'll just say not in that structure.
Yeah.
It's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge, especially for people that have not had both of those experiences and people that are undergoing a change, going typically from the corporate world to the small business world. I think it's a big challenge for them.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a welcome challenge and it's a welcome change, but it's not easy to shed, we'll say, some not bad practices, but just some things that have been institutionalized in you.
Yeah, actually, the perfect example. My anecdote is I thought I was ready to leave the military in 2016 on active duty. Fully thought, yes, I am prepared. Startup is the way to go. I'm going to do this. Jump out. Literally 3 months later, I was panicking because all of the frameworks and structure that I had grown up with my entire adult life, from 18 to 28, for a whole decade, from college on to like what I knew was, since I left my parents' house, was the military structure. And then to walk away and go, what is this startup thing? Everyone's making things up. Like, nothing makes sense. Like, are people telling the truth? Can they lie here? Like, they can just lie and say that they have something and they don't? What is this? Like, 3 months later, I immediately went and found a recruiter, and I was like, hey, I think the reserves is what I need right now. So I signed back in, and then actually that nicotine patch, that structure, it took me a couple of years, and now December 27th is my last day in the Army. Completely, I'm fully done. No more nicotine patch. Get out. Like,
That's the first time I've heard the reserves referred to as such. But
yeah. Oh, I think a lot of people do it. I have a friend of mine, one of my great friends now. I met him the first day I was in the reserves, he was in the reserves, and we both had the same combat patch. So in the Army, the whichever deployment you go on with whatever unit, you have that patch on your right shoulder. So I saw he had a similar patch, and we immediately bonded off that. But it was also both our first days. And during that first year, it was for us trying to figure out the civilian world together. Like, every month it was like a touch point for us, right? We only did once a month, but we would get together and then just contemplate what is the civilian world, what is our life next. For him, it was very different. He did join the corporate sector. We actually figured that out during our lunches during the battle assemblies or the drill weekends. Like, one day I asked him, I was like, why are you doing physical therapy stuff? I'm like, I don't feel like you have any interest. He's like, well, I just, I always thought physical stuff, because he enjoyed working out, he enjoyed sports and things like that. It's like, yeah, but your values don't necessarily align to that much. Why don't you just join, go get an MBA and do business instead of going through all the schooling just to go to PT school? And it was, I think it took 2 months. He made that decision. Now he's corporate. And that was because we figured out quickly what he actually wanted out of life. But it was that process. It was like we had to unwind from that structure and bureaucracy that told us what to do, told us how to think, and then having to figure that out. But yes, the Army Reserve for for me, as well as I think him, was more of a nicotine patch. He's still in. I think for, security reasons, like there's cheap insurance. I don't even know if he capitalizes on that. But for me, as an entrepreneur, that thing is just more burdensome than anything. Then they know. They're like, Eric's in Wisconsin again. Oh, Eric's in Michigan again. Eric's gone this weekend. Oh, he's gone for 2 weeks now. And it was just, you'd think that they plan better too. And then, yeah. So that's kind of my rant of why it's kind of incongruent. I should have learned that too early on. I actually had a superior officer there who ran his own law firm, and he told me, he was just like, "You're gonna get out eventually." And I was about a year in, still good on my nicotine patch. Just like, no, I think I'm gonna do this forever. He's like, "No, look at me." He's like, I stayed 20 years and I didn't get promoted because I have to go focus on my business. And I don't have time to actually, progress, because it's like the corporate side too. It's very, very corporate in the way that career progressions work. So yeah, that's a huge side tangent, I think.
It's not, it's the military is another example of just how on paper my wife and I are kind of different. Her family, both of her parents are Air Force, and they work on an air base in Indiana.
Yeah.
Her brother was pararescue.
Oh, wow.
And and it's like, yeah, I'm some guy from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So I've not having served myself, this is all kind of secondhand for me, but I get stories and just I think that in terms of talking about structure, what bigger structure is there than the military?
Yeah.
Right. And I can imagine going away from that it's a change, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, there's something that we used to tell soldiers all the time when we were actually on active duty. This is different than on the reserves. Well, it's like your weekends is a privilege, not a right. So we can take your weekends away if we want to. And you're like, what? As civilian, like in the civilian side, you can't even imagine what that's like. Like, yeah, but you're under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That's the thing that holds you, and it's so different. And trying to break away from that mindset sometimes it's a little bit difficult, I think, for some people. So,
how has it been for you? I mean, you talked about the nicotine patch, but
yeah, it took about two years, right? 2.5 years, and then I was pushing to get out. So finally put in my resignation packet about 8 months ago, and then it was approved. So yeah, get to go. Very excited about it, because then it's just one less thing to think about. No more texts. It's 1 week in a month, but it's way more than that.
Sure.
So they're bothering you throughout the month for things. For junior soldiers, they probably don't ever experience that, but for people who are a little bit more senior, you start realizing how much time they actually take back. I talked to a fellow commander at the time. He was like, I dedicate 20 hours a week to this. And I was like, 20 hours a week? They're paying us $800 a month, man.
That's a lot.
Yeah. I'm gonna walk.
But it's good to have people to talk to, right? Just people that are maybe at a different stage of their career. You can, have the benefit of their mentorship, but then maybe also you can, as Alex said, think about, is this where I want to be?
Yeah.
Is this who I want to be?
Right.
Yeah, I think it really is the identity. For them, I think, because maybe they have a corporate job and that it's just a means to an end, as you said kind of earlier on. To them, their identity is the soldier piece. So they're willing to do the 20 hours and then being able to accept, I'm more of a soldier than I am a corporate person, even though I only...
Yeah.
So for me, though, it's complete opposite. I'm like, no, I'm trying to break away from this. I want to be an entrepreneur, not the soldier anymore. So I think that was the difference between that guy and myself.
Do you guys watch Billions, the show?
No,
Oh.
I've heard of it though.
Anyway, not trying to make this a TV podcast or anything like that,
Yeah.
but
Oh, I don't care.
anyway, sorry.
It doesn't matter. Anything goes.
Anyway, lawyers and Wall Street and anyway, that's the setup. But there's a scene in there where you've got a relatively young district attorney, and he's talking with the defense counsel for the people that they're trying to prosecute. And this defense counsel is the guy's professor from law school. And at the same time, this defense counsel like works at this massive firm now, right, defending guys that this district attorney just doesn't respect, thinks everything wrong with America, blah blah blah. And the professor asks the district attorney, after the district attorney has like gone off on this rant about how it's everything that's wrong, asks him, you just work here, right? And that stuck with me. It's a show that's been on for 3 seasons. It's a fun show. Plenty of stuff is just it's quotable.
Yeah.
But in terms of things that you see in entertainment that stick with you on a more fundamental level, that would be one of those things from that show.
Yeah.
That if I really wanted to think existentially, probably somehow impacted my leaving my prior job.
Yeah.
Right? Of just this concept of taking on whatever it is that you're working on, and that is your mission, and that is just what you take on as your identity, as not just worth your time and what you get paid for, but as like, this is what I'm doing with my life.
That's who you are.
Yeah.
And that thought of, you just work here, right? Especially if it's somebody else, especially if you work for the government.
Yeah.
But just generally, whatever your employer is, right?
Yeah.
You just work there.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's a lot of people that are happy in their job where they're working for somebody else.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I think, speaks to the person who's the boss and the fact that they've built a good culture in the business.
Yeah.
But then there's also, I think, plenty of examples of people just drinking the Kool-Aid, and then that sometimes leads to disillusionment later on.
Yeah.
When, for whatever reason, they're forced to reassess.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess we can kind of. How long have we been?
Let's just wrap it up.
Yeah.
Oh shit! Oh,
Steve, too
cool.
But
It's 10:20.
for sure. Yeah. So as we close this off, Ilya, just real quick, in terms of like advice, I guess give your top 2, top 3 advice for entrepreneurs starting off or just continuing. What's like the secret to long-term success?
Sure. There's no such thing as job security,
Right.
unless you have your own clients. And then if you do have your own clients, it doesn't really matter necessarily whether or not you're working for yourself or for somebody else. But just your own clients, whatever that means in your industry, I think that should be the number one goal, right? For attorneys, it's their clients, and luckily with rules of professional conduct prohibit non-competes for attorneys. So when I did go out on my own the second time, people were allowed to follow me, and I benefited from that. But also, if you're a screenwriter, who are your clients? Well, it's the audience, right? It might also be the person who's going to buy your script, right? That studio exec. So just knowing who your clients are, and then building that book within your industry, I think is going to be crucial.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a hard lesson for a lot of this newer culture where people are building apps and random things like that, is that just because they wanted it, that's a focus group of one, and they don't really consult the market to see whether or not there actually is clients that are willing to utilize that. Just because something seems more efficient, that's what they go after. So I love that. Just being able to describe it is actually something that I've heard a lot of investors, that's one of the key things that VCs ask, which is describe your client to me. It's like demographics, like social economic, everything. Being able to figure out that thing, I love it. Like that's probably the best advice. Now, for just because you're an attorney, just what are some legal things to consider? We know that you can't give legal advice, but what are some things to consider
Sure.
prior to leaving?
Sure. So if you're leaving another job, or perhaps you've got a side gig, you definitely have to keep in mind whatever restrictive covenants you might have through your employment agreement, especially in the tech space, right? There's a lot of there's proprietary inventions and proprietary information and inventions agreements.
Yes.
Right. And so being mindful of what is currently governing you, not just when you leave, but before you leave, I think is something that's unavoidable for people looking to transition out of corporate space into the entrepreneur space. Also, the number one agreement that we ever really do in our work is an independent contractor agreement with freelancers, because with some types of intellectual property, you can only convey rights in that with a written agreement. And with what we're seeing a lot of businesses do is they're working with freelancers to then resell that freelancer's services or creative product to some end user, and you can only sell what you already own.
Okay.
So making sure that you've got your intellectual property rights with proper chain of title, very similar to real estate in that sense, right? You don't want to cloud your title.
Right.
And then be mindful of taxes, right? Like the execution of what business lawyers do is not necessarily that difficult. Yes, there, especially when you're drafting complicated contracts, of course, I'm not trying to trivialize that, but a lot of the time, like somebody says, I want to form an LLC, or I want to form a corporation, an S Corp. Right? An S Corp is not even an entity type, at least as far as lawyers are concerned. It's a tax election.
Okay.
Right? So the question has to be why. So forming a company is really, the execution of it, simple enough. Go online, get it done.
Yeah.
But the planning within the overall structure of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and just the why is it that you're doing this, that requires a lot of planning.
Yeah.
Oh, I want to form a Delaware company. Why?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's absolutely the right answer. Other times it's just because you heard something or read something on the internet.
Yeah.
So I guess getting to the why you want to do something on the legal side is very important. And then just planning accordingly, trying to think 3 steps ahead, and not forgetting taxes.
Yeah.
That's good information.
That's great.
That's awesome. Yeah, and so I appreciate your time, Ilya. And as
Thanks
like
for
closing thoughts, so where can people, listeners, where can they find you? What have you been up to in the current state today? How's your business looking like?
Sure. So in terms of finding us, as I mentioned, we only have a landing page, but we do have email and phone. So that's on the landing page. The firm's called Zlatkin Wong, zlatkinwong.com. Come check out our black and white site until we build it out. The one thing that I think has been very different this time, the first time I launched my firm, I built a Wix site.
Yeah.
And this time, categorically, I was like, we're paying somebody to do this.
Yeah.
Somebody, we have enough work that our time is better spent doing what we can actually do better
Right.
and get paid for it, rather than fiddle around with this. So LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a relatively unique name. There are only 2 Ilya Zlatkins in the U.S. There's probably more elsewhere. I'm not the programmer.
Yeah, not the
you know.
programmer.
I think he's a programmer who's also an artist.
You should build your website.
That would be hilarious. Another connection to
That's true.
We just plugged him too.
Yeah.
No idea who this person is. We
Yeah,
should-
I think
I'm gonna tag
because of the entrepreneur background,
Right.
I think I search up, I come up better in a search,
Right.
and I take great pride in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah, for the listeners out there, this was Ilya Zlatkin. He's the managing partner of Zlatkin Wong, and he shared a ton of wisdom over the course of the last, I think, hour.
That's
And,
generous.
Yeah. I really did. I think I got a lot of it out of it.
Cool.
Just perspective-wise, I think I'm beginning to think that doing this is just to give me better perspective, and hopefully the audience who's listening in gets better perspective on how to see the world in a different way. I thought that my way was right, or I have a specific lens in which I see things through, and then you've been able to alter that a little bit for the better, and I'm hoping that kind of continues for the audience that listens in. So thanks again for listening in. This is the Alone and So Very Afraid podcast. Tune in again next week for more content.
Thanks for having me.
All right.